Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act early in 1854, and Congress passed it in May that year. Lincoln was in Urbana when he heard the news of its passage, and he, like many of his friends, his fellow citizens here, was outraged. Lincoln began to speak out against it in the fall of that year, and when he did, he brought his opinions to the places where he was best known, to the friends he met along the 8th Judicial Circuit, no less in Champaign County than elsewhere. On the evening of October 24, 1854, Lincoln gave an impassioned speech against the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the Champaign County Courthouse. Staying at the Pennsylvania House on the day of his speech, he and David Davis and Henry Clay Whitney enjoyed lively conversation beforehand. Whitney says Lincoln gave the speech in the courthouse to the light of 11 tallow candles. He showed no ostentation, no preparation, and no labored effort. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed the Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide for themselves whether to be slave or free states. This had previously been prohibited by the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and later legislation. Up to this point, Lincoln had been opposed to slavery, but thought it would have to remain in the states where it already existed. When it appeared that slavery might spread, Lincoln reacted. Lincoln gave a series of speeches in Springfield, Bloomington, Peoria, and Urbana. Eventually, Lincoln's friends organized. In May 1856, the Urbana Union newspaper called for a meeting at the courthouse of opponents to the act. Winston and William Summers, Jarrah C. Sheldon, James Jackwith, and J.O. Cunningham were among those who met and sent delegates to the state's first Anti-Nebraska Act convention.
Cunningham and Whitney accompanied Lincoln to the convention. Lincoln gave a riveting speech which catapulted him forward among the anti-slavery faction. That fall, when Lincoln was in Urbana for the Circuit Court, the Republican National Convention was taking place in Philadelphia. When Lincoln was told he had received 110 votes for vice president, he said, "Surely, you must mean another Mr. Lincoln." The nominee from that convention was the explorer John C. Fremont. It took Lincoln no time to begin to campaign for him. As the locomotive steamed north through the depot, or West Urbana as some called it, new people, new faces arrived in town. Some of those faces were African American. Blacks and whites alike are said to have attended the church just to the east of the railroad tracks, just to the south of the Doan House, an inn which served as the station house. The church was known as the Goose Pond Church. When the Illinois Central Railroad built its tracks, they filled in a pond inhabited by geese and donated the land to the Congregational Church. It was at the Goose Pond that Abraham Lincoln spoke on the night of June 17, 1856, in support of the newly formed Republican Party and their presidential candidate, John C. Fremont. That new party grew out of opposition to the spread of slavery into the Western territories. An all-day rally for Fremont was held in Urbana on September 17th. A crowd of 5,000 was reported for the day. Lincoln and the speakers were accompanied by 2 brass bands and 30 young women bearing floral garlands, who represented the 30 states now in the Union. Lincoln said it reminded him of a large basket of roses. Lincoln gave a speech in Weber's Grove under an ancient elm tree, which stood for many years near the Big 4 railroad yard. After this speech, the Urbana Union stated, "As persuasive and convincing a speaker, the equal of Mr. Lincoln cannot be found." Apparently, Lincoln was convincing. Fremont carried Champaign County by 200 votes.
The opportunity to oppose the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act directly came in 1858, as Douglas's Senate seat was up for re-election. Lincoln seized the chance to debate Douglas at 7 different spots in Illinois. In fact, when Lincoln completed his first debate at Ottawa on August 22, 1858, he wrote to his friend Joseph Cunningham,
"Douglas and I, for the first time this canvass, crossed swords here yesterday. The fire flew some, and I am glad to know I am yet alive. There was a vast concourse of people, more than could get near enough to hear."
Lincoln made an appearance on September 23rd in Urbana. It was unfortunately the day after the county fair, and a small crowd was expected. However, a Chicago newspaper reporter wrote,
"The number present was very nearly, if not quite, as large as those in attendance at the Douglas demonstration yesterday. The enthusiasm was 10 times as great."
Lincoln arrived at the Doan House the day before, stayed overnight with a local family, the Badleys, in West Urbana, and then returned to the Doan House to be paraded by the locals, accompanied by bands and young ladies on horseback all the way to the fairgrounds. Lincoln gave a version of his House Divided speech that evening at the courthouse. He stayed that evening with Ezekiel Boyden, the mayor of Urbana. Despite strong support and a general feeling that he won the debates, Lincoln was unsuccessful in his bid against Douglas. Senators were elected by state legislators then, and the Illinois legislature was dominated by too many holdover Democrats for Lincoln to overcome. Lincoln returned to the Circuit Court in Urbana in April and October 1859. It was during this April 1859 visit to Champaign County that Lincoln visited the offices of the Central Illinois Gazette and met with John Scroggs, the publisher, and William Stoddard, its young upstart manager. Stoddard, new in town, was astounded at Lincoln's knowledge of his Champaign County friends and supporters. Stoddard said of this meeting, "He seems to know my prairie neighbors man for man." Stoddard was so enthralled by Lincoln, he ran the following headline December 21st, 1859, "Abraham Lincoln for President." Stoddard would later become Lincoln's third secretary, handling correspondence in the White House. The first official endorsement Abraham Lincoln received for president was at the Republican State Convention in Decatur. Ezekiel Boyden, Urbana's mayor, B.F. Harris, Muhammad Cattleman and friend, and John Scroggs of the Central Illinois Gazette were there, supporting Lincoln's candidacy. Another Urbana man, Henry Russell, was responsible for sneaking in 300 pro-Lincoln supporters to the National Convention in Chicago as spectators, taking the place of those who would have supported Seward. Scroggs' Central Illinois Gazette would proclaim on November 7, 1860, "The county, all right," as Lincoln became president. Lincoln won the county 1,792 to 1,251 against Douglas. Lincoln last saw Champaign County from the back of a train as he briefly stopped in Tolono to give a short speech. It was recorded in the Chicago newspapers.
I am leaving you on an errand of national importance, attended, as you are aware, with considerable difficulties. Let us believe, as some poet expressed it, "Behind the cloud the sun is shining." I bid you an affectionate farewell.
Once in Washington, Lincoln did not forget his Central Illinois friends. He made appointments from among them, and they endorsed his choices. A group of his fellow lawyers from the Bar Association of Champaign County wrote in 1862 to endorse his choice of Judge David Davis for Supreme Court judge. Many of Lincoln's old friends and fellow lawyers would head up regiments in the Union Army: Busey, Kohler, and Wolfe. 2,200 men from Champaign County joined the ranks, with Samuel Busey and William Kohler from Muhammad and Homer, Tolono and Sodorus, Urbana and West Urbana. Certainly some of West Urbana's first African-American residents were on hand at the Goose Pond Church the night Lincoln gave his Kansas-Nebraska speech, and just a few years later, in 1863, the ranks of the 29th Illinois Colored Troops, as they were called at the time, were filled with the likes of Peyton Caldwell and Jay Clements, Dennis Jackson, and George Johnson. George Johnson would later be one of the founders of the Salem Baptist Church in the mid-1860s, one of two churches formed in the neighborhood of the Goose Pond. The other, the African Methodist Episcopal Church at the corner of 4th and Park, was founded possibly as early as 1863. Lincoln never returned to see his friends in Illinois, but when the news came that Lincoln had been assassinated, the entire county mourned. Cunningham wrote of the loss,
Saturday, April 15th, was the most mournful day ever witnessed in Urbana. He was not only our president and chief magistrate, but our fellow citizen.
The following Wednesday, the businesses were all closed. Homes and shops were draped with black bunting. Nearly the entire community felt the same way as Cunningham. His great kindness and urbanity of manner here, as everywhere else, had won for him a warm corner in our hearts.